We were very excited when we learned after last year's calamitous hearings on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court that Ruth Marcus was writing a book on the subject, because we knew that if anyone could deliver an in-depth, behind-the-scenes account of what happened, and also put the whole drama into a grander political context, it would be Ruth. And she hasn't disappointed. Her new book, Supreme Ambition, is revealing, insightful, and even-handed, and its fast-paced and lucid prose make for a really, really compelling read. In the acknowledgments, Ruth calls this a book she's been preparing to write for her entire career, and indeed she brought to it a wealth of knowledge and experience. Educated in history at Yale and in the law at Harvard, Ruth went right into journalism after her studies and has spent a 35-year career at the Washington Post, closely observing how Washington works and developing a wide network of friends and sources, I think nearly all of whom are here tonight. As a reporter or editor, Ruth was involved in coverage of such key institutions as the White House, Congress, Justice Department, and Supreme Court. And then in 2003, she joined the Post editorial board, where she's risen to the position of a deputy editor. In 2006, she began writing a regular column, and already the next year was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in commentary. At that time, the Pulitzer judges cited, quote, her intelligent and incisive commentary on a range of subjects using a voice that can be serious or playful, and all that remains true of her columns to this day. As for the Kavanaugh story, many of us no doubt followed it on TV and in the media very closely, but Ruth, in researching her book, conducted nearly 300 interviews and reveals much we didn't know about how Kavanaugh's nomination came about and was then pushed through the Senate. Beyond just filling in details about Kavanaugh's ascension, Ruth also places it in the larger context of a calculated, 3 decades-long conservative effort to cement control over the High Court. That campaign, as Ruth describes, ended up merging last year with Kavanaugh's own lifelong aim to secure a spot on the court. It was the joining of two supreme ambitions in what turned into a very messy and flawed confirmation process with disturbing and lasting consequences for Kavanaugh, the court, and our country. As with any good columnist, Ruth, who has known Kavanaugh for years, offers up her own informed opinion and tells us very clearly in the final pages of her book what she thinks of the court's newest justice and his confirmation. Her own judgment, as is very typical of Ruth, is very tough, but also exceedingly fair. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ruth Marcus.
Hi, oh good, I can see over this. I was a little worried. Wow, hi everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much, Brad. Brad stole half of what I wanted to say, but one of the things he stole that I wanted to say was the story of being able to be here tonight, because the book is published today, and it's every author's ambition to be at Politics and Prose to talk about her book. And as it happened, I ran into Brad and Lissa at an event not that long ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, when it was decided at the last-ish minute by my publisher that we were going to speed up publication to today, December 3rd. And the actual true story of what happened was that I told Lissa the book was being published December 3rd. Lissa said to Brad, Ruth's book is coming out December 3rd. And Brad said, oh, well, we don't do events in December. And Lissa turned to Brad and said, well, now we do. And is that okay to tell? If you know Lissa, you know it's a true story. And I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled to see my friends and my family and my colleagues, and also unfamiliar faces who I hope have been readers and I hope will enjoy reading this book. I want to give a shout out before I talk about my book to another author whose book is being published today, my friend Tom Rosensteil, whose third novel, it's called Oppo. Rosensteil, are you here? Well, okay, hi. And if you are someone or know someone, which you might if you're here tonight, who's interested in how Washington works, Tom's books do precisely what Supreme Ambition tries to do, which is to talk about D.C. behind the scenes, except he has maybe a little more gunfire. And I was thinking about saying a little more sex, but we'll see about that. Tom's first novel, Shining City, was actually about vetting a Supreme Court nominee. So I would say that maybe if the Trump administration had brought on Tom's protagonist, Peter Reina, they might have saved themselves some trouble. But they didn't, and vetting seems to be a particular not strength of this administration. So here I am. Supreme Ambition is my first book, but as Brad said in his introduction, quoting me, it's really the book I've been preparing to write my whole life. And the idea of writing it came to me very, very late in the confirmation process, after that astonishing day that we all remember when Christine Blasey Ford and then Brett Kavanaugh testified about her allegations. And as the FBI was conducting and then quickly, and I would say too quickly, concluding its investigation, and as then Judge Kavanaugh seemed to be hurtling, and in fact was hurtling, toward confirmation. And I had been looking for the right book to write for a few years now, and because writing a book was on my bucket list. And the Kavanaugh confirmation exploded, and I thought two things. One was, there is a great behind-the-scenes story that we don't know yet for all the fantastic reporting that my colleagues at the Post and elsewhere did about the Kavanaugh nomination. There's just a great story of what's going on behind the scenes here. And the second, which I'll talk about more, is that this is a story that's bigger than Brett Kavanaugh. It's a story about the court. It's a story about the 3-decade-long conservative effort to finally cement control of the court, which is what was achieved with the Kavanaugh confirmation. And so I hope when you read the book that you will decide that I've achieved both of those goals, that I've both taken you behind the scenes and that I've told the larger story, and just a couple of the behind the scenes moments, and there's so many delicious ones. There's the moment when, and I'm not making this one up, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Senator Chuck Grassley, the ranking member and the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and their two top aides are gathered in a bathroom off the Senate Judiciary Committee anteroom. Senator Feinstein motioned Senator Grassley in, asked the aide to go get the other aide so she could tell him for the first time about the Christine Blasey Ford allegations. And, you know, I have a picture in my iPhone, I think I tweeted it the other day, of this bathroom, which looks like the faculty bathroom in a high school, or maybe in a middle school. And, that is the place where history was made. The moment when, one of my favorite moments from not very long after that, when White House counsel Don McGahn is dealing with the aftermath of the Christine Blasey Ford testimony in that short time period between when she testified and Brett Kavanaugh took the stand. And he and everybody thinks at that point that Brett Kavanaugh's nomination is sunk. And the president of the United States is trying to call Don McGahn. And he calls him, and Don McGahn is, if you can imagine, ignoring phone calls from his boss, who also happens to be the most important person on the planet. Finally, Don McGahn's deputy, a woman named Annie Donaldson, reaches him and says, the president's trying to get you. You need to talk to him. And Don McGahn has not been taking the calls because he's convinced, correctly or not, that the president is prepared to pull the nomination. He doesn't want to hear it. So he tells Annie Donaldson, I don't talk to quitters. So I'm really looking forward to having President Trump read that one. when he reads the book, which I think he did because he tweeted the other day that it was not only badly written, but he typed this twice, badly researched. Which rhymes with something. And Donald Trump wasn't the only president who was having a hard time getting his phone calls through in the midst of the Kavanaugh craziness. There's this magnificent scene. This is the day after the hearings when Senator Jeff Flake decides at the very last minute that he's going to want and need, in order to secure his vote, an FBI investigation. And it's like the scene in the Marx Brothers movie where everybody's crowded into the stateroom because for every senator and every staffer associated with the Judiciary Committee is crowded into this anteroom. And Flake and Senator Coons, who's from Delaware, who's been trying to get him to agree to the FBI investigation, desperately trying to get him to agree to the FBI investigation, are huddled together in a phone booth trying to reach the FBI director. And somebody comes through with a phone saying, President Bush is trying to reach Senator Flake. President Bush is trying to reach Senator Flake because President George W. Bush started out as Brett Kavanaugh's biggest hurdle when Brett Kavanaugh was trying to get chosen to be the Supreme Court nominee, but he then turned into Kavanaugh's biggest advocate with the senators. Senator Flake said he was too busy to talk to President Bush, but he didn't call him a quitter, so that's a good thing. In that same scene, we have Senator Ben Sasse bursting into the anteroom. He's angry at Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, over some information that he thought Senator Whitehouse was peddling that was adverse to Judge Kavanaugh. And he says, "Where's Sheldon? I want to fight that guy." So it's both the crowded Marx Brothers scene and, like a high school gymnasium. So we're here, and I probably wouldn't have written this book had it not been for the uproar over the Christine Blasey Ford allegations. And except for those of you who are members of my immediate family, or maybe the members of the book group that I've been part of for 30 years, hi guys, you wouldn't be here either if it wasn't for Christine Blasey Ford. But what I want to talk about a little bit is that in many ways, there's a lot of people I see in this room who have lived this along with me. The story of the Kavanaugh confirmation is bigger and in many ways more important than that showdown that transfixed us all in the fall of 2018. So I wanted to tell the story about what happened behind the scenes, but I did want to spend some time in the book and spend some time this evening talking about the larger history and the broader implications of the Kavanaugh battle. So if you indulge me, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few chapters of my life that intersect with that history and give you a sense of what led up to the Kavanaugh confirmation. So the first is, and by the way, Brad mentioned something that I want to point out because I have one huge reporting failure in this book that I need to confess to. So like me, Brett Kavanaugh was a history major at Yale College, and every history major at Yale College has to write a senior thesis. I could not, for the life of me, figure out, though I spent a lot of time trying to report on it, what his senior thesis was about. So if you're looking for criticism of the book, it's she spent all that time and couldn't find out what he wrote his senior thesis on. But during the time I was in law school, progressives really ruled the legal academy, and in fact, they still do. And the notion of interpreting the Constitution according to the original intent of the framers was viewed as this kind of a wacky outlier idea, and it wasn't something that anybody took particularly seriously. And it was sometime in my first or second year of law school that a band of conservatives who were sort of this beleaguered minority on law school campuses got together at Yale, and they had a conference for something that they called the Federalist Society, which was obviously going nowhere and was never going to grow to be influential, and was just a way to make themselves feel good because they had such a crazy notion of how to interpret the Constitution. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. The Federalist Society grew from this band of, as I say, wonky and beleaguered conservatives to become a kind of employment agency for conservative lawyers, especially when Republican presidents were in office, and increasingly the vetting agency for getting these lawyers on the federal bench. And it became very helpful for one, not very many years later, Yale law student named Brett Kavanaugh. And shortly after I came to the Post in 1987 was the first new, and it's a first episode, but it's still a very raw episode. And Al Kamen from the Post and I wrote about this at excruciating length. The first episode in the judicial nominations wars with Ronald Reagan's nomination of Robert Bork, a judge on the D.C. Circuit, where Brett Kavanaugh would later serve. And it sounds quaint now, but one of the main arguments during the Bork debate was about whether or not it was legitimate to take a nominee's ideology into account in deciding whether he or she, and of course there was only one she on the court at the time, should be confirmed. Something that might also sound quaint, it was viewed as a remarkable departure from the usually staid atmosphere of the confirmation proceedings when an outside group called People for the American Way released an advertisement narrated by actor Gregory Peck that attacked Bork and argued that he shouldn't be confirmed. And of course, today, multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns have just become the norm in judicial confirmations. Bork was defeated, and this is the third piece of quaintness about him. 6 Republicans voted against confirming him. 2 Democrats voted in favor, and that's a set of defections from the party that are all but unimaginable today. And the Bork defeat, in many ways, led us directly to Judge Kavanaugh. First, after Judge Bork was defeated, and then some people in this room remember the next nominee was Judge Ginsburg, who was defeated for the also quaint idea that it was improper to smoke marijuana with your students when you were a teacher at Harvard Law School. This was huge news because we remember it. And the number 3 choice was a man who was a judge on the Federal Appeals Court in California named Anthony Kennedy, for whom, of course, Brett Kavanaugh later clerked, and whose retirement paved the way for Kavanaugh's nomination. So had it not been for Judge Bork's defeat and Justice Kennedy's ultimate selection, it is very possible we would not have Justice Kavanaugh today. The Bork defeat was also a never-again moment for the conservative legal movement. This was their chance to secure a solid conservative majority on the court, though it was a much less conservative court than the court we have today and the court that Justice Kennedy left in the summer of 2018. And conservatives were beaten on Bork, and they vowed from that moment that that was not going to happen again. The Federalist Society and its vice president, Leonard Leo, began to assemble the architecture, financial architecture, institutional architecture, to make certain that that wasn't going to happen. Those Gregory Peck ads from People for the American Way were overtaken by these humongous and instantaneous advertising campaigns. So fast forward to 1991 and the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings. And that was the second precursor to the Kavanaugh hearings that I lived through. In fact, full disclosure, it's how I met my husband. He was an aide to a Democratic senator on the Judiciary Committee, and I was covering it for the Washington Post. And no, we didn't start dating till afterwards, but there was a lot of talk of sex in the interim, not between us, but anyway. Okay. This was a different kind of confirmation battle, as I say, not about ideology, but about sex. And the issue, for if there's anybody in the room who doesn't remember it or wasn't even born yet, the issue was whether Justice Thomas, when he was the head of the EEOC, or earlier when he was an official in the Education Department, had made inappropriate sexual comments to Anita Hill, who was a lawyer on his staff. And this was an episode that was both different from and an eerie precursor to the Kavanaugh hearings. It was different from them because the Judiciary Committee was then entirely male. And as much as these male senators said they understood that sexual harassment was a problem, they really didn't. They just didn't get it. They couldn't fathom how, if Anita Hill was alleging what Anita Hill was alleging was true, how she could have not come forward with her allegations. And certainly they couldn't imagine how she could have then followed him to a different position when he went to the EEOC. It was the same, and shockingly the same, as the Kavanaugh nomination in a number of ways. One is the last-minute nature of the allegations. Another is the vehement denial and the volcanic anger that we saw first from Justice Thomas, and then almost identically, except with the racial element removed, from Justice Kavanaugh. And that leads us to the next chapter that brings this all together, which is impeachment. Not the current impeachment, but the Clinton one, because that's how I met Brett Kavanaugh. He was a smart young lawyer working for Ken Starr, the independent counsel. I was a less smart and less young writer doing legal analyses of the Starr report and the subsequent impeachment proceedings. And the Starr moment was another one of those real turning points for Brett Kavanaugh. In law school, his friends kind of had this vague understanding that he was a guy who was conservative, probably a Republican, but he wasn't floridly conservative. He wasn't the standout conservative on the campus. In fact, he was a first-year law student that fall when the Bork nomination was being debated, and nobody can remember him expressing a view on that, it was the talk of the campus. After all, Judge Bork had been an esteemed professor at Yale Law School. And so he was a good, solid law student, not a law student that any of his classmates thought was going to end up on the Supreme Court one day. And then an amazing piece of luck came his way. He had been clerking for a perfectly respectable Republican-appointed judge in Delaware on the Third Circuit named Walter Stapleton, and an opportunity arose that changed his life. There are some judges who are feeder judges who regularly send clerks to the Supreme Court. Judge Stapleton was not a feeder judge. In fact, there was one clerk and one clerk only who clerked for Judge Stapleton and went on to the Supreme Court, and that is Justice Kavanaugh. Went on to be a Supreme Court clerk, and that is Justice Kavanaugh. Then Brett Kavanaugh had actually lost out on a Supreme Court clerkship himself. He had an interview with the Chief Justice Rehnquist, and it's great to get to the interview stage, but he didn't get the job. And it looked like he was going to go on to have a perfectly satisfying and very prestigious legal career. He was planning to go work at Williams & Connolly, a fine law firm here in town. And then he got a call that changed his life. He got a call from a Yale Law School professor who headed the Federalist Society, but didn't actually remember really that Brett Kavanaugh had been in the Federalist Society. But he came to mind because he knew him very well from the basketball court. By the way, the sports thing, I don't know if you guys in this room know it, but doing sports is incredibly valuable to your career. And I say guys because I grew up in the pre-Title IX era, so don't get mad at me. I'm sure it's valuable to women's careers too. When Justice Kavanaugh applied to Yale College, by the way, there were two questions on the Yale application. Both of his essays, it turns out, were about basketball. It worked. I don't know. So George Priest calls Brett Kavanaugh and says, Alex Kaczynski, a judge on the Ninth Circuit in California, has an opening in his chambers. I hear some noise there because some of you may know of Judge Kaczynski from his later notoriety as a judge who needed to resign or retire after allegations about his own misbehavior and sexual misconduct in terms of inappropriate comments and behavior towards female clerks and other lawyers came up. Judge Kaczynski had a sudden opening in his chambers. There was a guy named Alex Azar. This world is so small. Alex Azar, now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, had been angling for a clerkship with Judge Kaczynski for almost since he got to law school. He got it. And then mysteriously, for reasons that are kind of still cloaked in mystery, he left the clerkship after 6 weeks. That created an opening that changed, as I said, Brett Kavanaugh's life. He was asked by George Priest if he was interested. He said, heck yes, headed out to California, and that set him on a completely different trajectory. That sent him first to work for then Solicitor General Starr in the Solicitor General's office. It opened up the possibility and then the reality of a clerkship with Justice Kennedy, because Judge Kaczynski was, in fact, the person who helped to select. He had been a clerk for Judge Kennedy on the appeals court, and he helped to select Justice Kennedy's clerks. And that changed Brett Kavanaugh's life. He then, based on that earlier relationship with Judge Starr, then Solicitor General Starr, went to work for Starr when he was investigating the Clintons in impeachment. And this was another turning point in Brett Kavanaugh's life. And it was a huge surprise to some of his friends because they thought it was quite a partisan choice for him. And they were even more surprised when they couldn't find the right page of their book, of their speech. They were even more surprised when he went to clerk for Starr, where he really developed this animus towards the Clintons that we then saw emerge in the hearings, where he talked about the desire for revenge on behalf of the Clintons. And that was a really amazing moment, but it wasn't that amazing to some of the people who had heard Brett Kavanaugh talk about the Clintons and how corrupt they were and how much he disliked and disrespected them back during the Starr hearings. And so I'm missing the great piece here. And so there was Brett Kavanaugh clerking for Starr, and there was me working for the Washington Post. That's how we first started speaking to each other. And in the course of researching this book, and my terrific researcher, Isabel Taft, is here tonight, I ran across an email in the voluminous, there were thousands and thousands of really boring pages from Brett Kavanaugh, but one from his emails at the Bush White House. And one of them turned out to be an email that mentioned me. And it said something like this. It was March 5th, 2001. So it's right after George W. Bush takes office, just a few months. And it says, I got a call from Ruth Marcus at the Washington Post. I haven't talked to her or any other reporter since I took this job, but I did get to know her quite well during the Starr investigation when I was assigned to brief her. And she's invited me to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And is it okay if we go? Of course, he says, under no illusions about her motive here, parentheses, buttering me up. But I think it would be good if but let me know if we can go. I had almost no recollection of this moment. And I was, in fact, not intending to butter up Brett Kavanaugh. I had a theory of the case that it was a really good idea if you were doing these things to invite people who would appreciate the invitation as opposed to people who would roll their eyes at being required to go to yet another White House Correspondents' Dinner. And so I presume that he got the okay because he went. I have to say, I never could have imagined from that moment that he would end up where he was today, or that I would end up talking to you tonight about Justice Brett Kavanaugh. But here I am, and I'm really looking forward to answering your questions about him or the book or almost anything else, but the book would be good. So come to the microphone if you would, so people can hear your question.
Hello.
Hi.
I have not read the book, but I've been very interested in your work, so thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
So my question is, there are a lot of allegations, be it about the actual assault or things like Devil's Triangle or his drinking habits, that Brett Kavanaugh actually consciously lied in his testimony. Do you believe he did? And if so, why or why not?
Okay. So I do not believe that Brett Kavanaugh consciously lied in his testimony about whether he assaulted Christine Blasey Ford or did any of the other sexual allegations that arose. I think there's arguments to be made about sort of skirting around the truth regarding what is the meaning of Devil's Triangle, or what was the meaning of Renata Alumnius, or all the other ridiculous. I mean, can you believe that we're discussing people's high school yearbook pages and dissecting them? So the reason that I just to be absolutely clear, I do believe that Christine Blasey Ford was telling the truth. I don't believe she had any motive to not tell the truth. She had every motive not to come forward. She was unable. This is a woman who was unable to return to her house for 3 months until Christmas. She didn't get back to her house until Christmas Eve after all of this came forward. It's turned her life upside down. She had mentioned the allegations she had in the memory of Brett Kavanaugh to her husband and other friends well before he was on his way to the Supreme Court. And the notion that some Republicans suggested that something terrible had happened to her was the story that they said, but she was simply mistaken about who it was. That just makes zero sense to me. But that said, and perhaps I'm being naive, though I don't think I'm a particularly naive person after all these years in Washington, but from everything that I could tell, from all of the people I spoke with who knew Brett Kavanaugh very, very well, I do not believe that he remembers this incident. My surmise, my assessment is that this was another drunken night for Brett Kavanaugh and another sort of, I'm going to use the word boisterous, but that downplays the significance and harm of what he did. But he was messing around and misbehaving in a drunken way that night. He doesn't remember it because it wasn't a big deal to him, and Christine Blasey Ford remembers it very vividly. So that's my long answer to your good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. First, I want to say it's become customary to thank servicemen and women for their service. And I think since 2016, it should become customary to thank journalists for their service. My question is this. It's only since 2016 that I've actually taken note of the tagline on the Post masthead, "Democracy dies in darkness." Has it been there for a long time, or is it just that it fits?
Well, first of all, on the service thing, it is, thank you, but that it's one of those things that makes me in particular feel uncomfortable, because all I do is sit in my office or sit at my kitchen counter and spout opinions, and the worst I have to endure is nasty tweets from the president, and that's just fine with me. And so we're not, and there are journalists who are in harm's way, and there are journalists who are scared when they go to Trump rallies. And but I think it's really remarkable that people for the first time in our career are thanking us for what we're doing. And I completely appreciate that, because if the president has taught us one thing, it is that the importance of journalism, not necessarily the opinion writing that I do, but the fact-based reporting that my colleagues on the news side do. Democracy Dies in Darkness is a Jeff Bezos innovation. It's new to the Post with the Bezos acquisition of the Post. So that's the answer to that question.
Thank you.
I thought it was cheesy. I shouldn't say this. I thought it was cheesy at the start, but now I really, really like it. And I give my friends Democracy Dies in Darkness onesies for their babies or their grandchildren.
How is it possible that buried in the middle of the front section was the story that President Trump is forcing the Defense Department to give a $400 million contract to somebody he admires where they'd already been rejected because their bid was inadequate? How does the Post not put that on the front page? how is the Post sort of reorienting its coverage from important stories like that and the abhorrence of how people should feel about that, and then they put on these, happy public, soft stories.
I can't speak to coverage decisions on the news side, but I would note that story was in the newspaper and on the website. And I would, if you don't mind, rather answer questions about my own book than
Well,
broader questions about the Washington Post.
I haven't read your book, but
Okay,
but I've
but-
read your columns for years, and I think you would feel the same way.
It doesn't make any sense for me to engage in second guessing about news decisions. So, but thank you. And thanks for reading.
After the Kavanaugh nomination took place, I called Senator Harris's office and suggested that it might be a fruitful area of investigation to look at the relationship between Kavanaugh and Ken Starr while Starr was president of Baylor, a tenure which ended unhappily. Do you cover any of that stuff in your book? And
I don't. I actually don't see that is not something that came to my attention. It's not something that I looked into. Okay. So maybe for the paperback.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you explain what happened with the FBI investigation? Did Senator Coons get taken by Senator Flake? Just how did that get aborted?
That is a great question. Okay, so the FBI investigation was something that was not going to happen. The White House and the Republican senators, Senator McConnell and others, were just what they wanted to do was whatever it took to get Justice Kavanaugh, then Judge Kavanaugh, across the finish line. And so originally the plan, and I write about this in the book, was not even to have a hearing at all. Senator Grassley and Senator McConnell had a meeting with members of the Judiciary Committee, and they said, well, let's just have, private interviews with her. And Lindsey Graham said, no, that's not going to fly. And Jeff Flake said, no, that's going to fly. So we got the hearings. And then famously, Senator Flake was accosted in the elevator after he told me that it was the most sleepless night he had spent in the Senate. And he woke up in the morning deciding that he was going to vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. He was Senator Coons had been importuning him to think more and at least to have an FBI investigation. That an FBI investigation could happen quickly enough that Kavanaugh could still be confirmed if nothing came up in plenty of time. And so famously, despite all of his colleagues gathered around him trying to get him to change his mind, and the former president, George Bush, trying to reach him to vouch for Judge Kavanaugh, Senator Flake demanded an FBI investigation, and he was backed up in that by Senator Murkowski and Senator Collins, and those votes were essential. And so, though I write in the book that actually behind the scenes, Judge Kavanaugh wanted an FBI investigation, it was Don McGahn who was insisting, no, don't do that. It's going to open a can of worms. We only need to worry about one thing, 50 votes, 50 votes, 50 votes, because of course the vice president could break the tie. When they decided to do the FBI investigation, the question was, what's the scope of the FBI investigation? And there was a very easy answer to that. It was whatever Senator Flake, Senator Collins, and Senator Murkowski insisted on. And so they did insist, for example, that the FBI interview Debbie Ramirez, who was the Yale classmate of Judge Kavanaugh's, who recalled him exposing himself to her when he was at Yale. But there was a very limited scope of that investigation, and it was very carefully controlled by Don McGahn, the White House counsel, in consultation with those key senators. And to me, the most upsetting and appalling dereliction of duty occurred when a man named Max Steyer, who privately told people that he had seen Judge Kavanaugh expose himself, being sort of propelled towards another woman who, in another incident that was very evocative of the incident that Deborah Ramirez remembered. And by the way, just to be very clear, the woman he allegedly exposed himself to does not remember this incident, does not, was quite inebriated at the time, apparently. But just to be clear, she's told friends that she doesn't remember the incident. But so this witness, a man named Max Steyer, who's the head, ironically, of a good government group here in town, very well known, very good relations with key senators, tried desperately to get his information to the FBI, enlisted 2 former federal prosecutors with good relations with the FBI to try to get the FBI to take his information. Wasn't going to happen. Then he tried to reach out to Susan Collins. Senator Collins says she doesn't remember him reaching out to her directly or indirectly. That didn't work. Then he went in desperation. By the way, he and Senator Collins, he wasn't a stranger to her. She had served on one of his advisory committees. They had worked together. He went to Senator Coons, said, I have this information. I can't get the FBI to pay attention to it. Senator Coons wrote a letter to the FBI director. This is a letter from a United States senator, but not just any United States senator. It's a letter from one of FBI Director Christopher Wray's law school classmates. The letter says, please interview this one person. I importune you. His name is Max Steyer. The letter is CC'd both to Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and to Dianne Feinstein, the ranking member. Max Steyer is not interviewed. Then Senator Coons, desperate to get attention to this, starts to reach out to his colleagues. He calls, and this is all, in the course of days as the clock is ticking and the FBI is producing and then delivering its report. He reaches out to Senator Flake and says, there's this guy you need to talk to. And Senator Flake says, I'm dealing with death threats against my family. I can't deal with it. I can't talk to him. He reaches out. He tries to reach out. Sends an email to Senator Collins. Doesn't hear back from her. Why not? It turns out that Senator Collins' email has been widely disseminated in the middle of this whole mess. So she changes her email. And Senator Coons, she sends a note to her colleagues saying, here's my new email. Senator Coons sends the email to Senator Collins' previous email. It was not until I called Senator Collins' office about a year later that they found this email from Senator Coons. But Senator Collins, in an interview with me, made it exquisitely clear that it was by the time she heard about this, or she would have gotten the email that went astray, it was too late in the game, she thought. And it wasn't going to change her vote. And she said to me, well, the victim doesn't remember it. How could we go forward on that basis? My answer would be, there are lots of unfortunate victims of sexual misconduct or sexual assault who are too inebriated to remember what happened to them. And what we needed to do was to have an investigation that would get Max Steyer's testimony, talk to the woman herself, see what she did or didn't remember, and at least figure out what happened so that we could get some clarity, the clarity that might be useful for Judge Kavanaugh to avoid a blot on his record, clarity that might be useful for the Senate to know precisely the background of the nominee that it was voting on. But the FBI investigation, I've gone on about this at some length because I think it's so important. The FBI investigation was not a hunt for the truth. It was a hunt for 50 votes, and that's what they got. They got 51 in the end.
I was going to ask about Yale, so I don't need to go ahead.
Like your husband and many people here, I used to work in the Senate. I thought that Senator Feinstein made a grave error in not raising the issue earlier with Senator Grassley, notwithstanding the fact it's a very partisan atmosphere, it's still that's sort of Senate politics 101. And I'm wondering if you think it would have been any different if this had been raised in an earlier time and in a better way.
A time when the Senate worked.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like earlier in the process.
Well, when you ask Democrats about that, and I've asked many, many Democratic senators and aides about that, they just guffaw at you because the Senate is a different institution than the one that you worked in. And it's not, Senator Grassley's aides would tell you that they would have taken it seriously, that he has a commitment and a history of protecting whistleblowers. So, of course, Senator Feinstein's should have shared it with him. Democrats believe that if Senator Feinstein had taken the information to Senator Grassley, that would have gone immediately to the White House because they need to be involved in any FBI investigation that would look into this, and it would have been immediately disseminated. I think it's an important and reasonable question, but I would say there was a middle ground for Senator Feinstein also because she got this information. It was very, very explosive. At that point, Christine Blasey Ford had been discussing this with a number of her friends in Palo Alto. If there's one lesson that we learned from the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill episode, it's that things come out, things leak. And so I think some people disagree with me. I think it was almost inevitable that this was going to leak, but I think for certain that this was information that was too explosive for a single senator to make the decision on her own about whether to share it or not share it. She was in an exquisitely difficult position because Christine Blasey Ford did not want to come forward, deserved to not be pushed forward unless she wanted to. The Feinstein staff believed through the summer that she was eventually going to come forward. But what I suggest in the book is that where Senator Feinstein, as difficult a situation as she was in, made a tragically wrong choice was in not at least sharing that decision that she made to keep the information to herself with her Senate colleagues, with the leadership, with Dick Durbin, who is both on the committee and in the leadership with the minority leader, Chuck Schumer. That was just too much power and difficulty and dangerous information for one senator to make that decision completely on her own.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, how are you? Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Had the FBI done a thorough job, what would they have found?
Well, we don't. That's a great question. We don't know. I don't know. Maybe they would have found that there was no corroboration for any of these stories. Maybe they would have found if they had been able to follow the Republicans. I'm interrupting myself to say that Republicans here would say the FBI, this was not, you're being naive, Ruth, and you don't understand the way the FBI works. This is not a criminal investigation where the FBI is free to follow leads wherever they might take them and go down every last rabbit hole. In this situation, and this is correct, this is not a criminal investigation, it's a background investigation. And in this circumstance, the FBI operates at the direction of its client, which is the White House. And so I believe if the FBI director were standing here tonight, he would say, we did what we were told to do. I would say you had information that you knew might be relevant and you didn't pursue it. I can't say where an investigation by the FBI, with the authority that it has, people in background investigations aren't compelled to talk to FBI agents. They don't have subpoena power in that situation. But nonetheless, when the FBI agent knocks on your door, you're a little bit more inclined to talk to the FBI agent than you might be inclined to talk to the Washington Post reporter. So it could have been exculpatory for Justice Kavanaugh. It could have been very dangerous for him. I think it's very interesting That that look he had on his face when he was testifying, when Senator Durbin and others kept saying, "Why don't you want an FBI investigation? Why don't you say you have an FBI investigation?" The reality was he had kept saying that he wanted one, but he couldn't go against Don McGahn because Don McGahn was key to keeping the support behind him to get him to the court. So I don't know.
But you said a minute ago, just to follow up, that things tend to leak in Washington. And since the Kavanaugh hearings, there hasn't been much leakage that reinforced what Christine Blasey Ford said.
Well, there hasn't been much investigation either. I mean,
but you investigated.
Well, I spent most of my time trying to figure out who Brett Kavanaugh was, what to understand about his biography that could help us understand what kind of justice he was, how he was chosen. And one of the most interesting aspects of the whole selection process was the anxiety that social conservatives had about Judge Kavanaugh and whether he would be conservative enough. And what happened behind the scenes as his confirmation proceeded and after her allegations came forward. So I did try, and certainly others have tried to do more reporting, but I would say the FBI badge might be a little bit more persuasive.
Well, maybe next time.
Next time.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Anybody else? Hi, Owen.
Thank you very much for your book. In his introduction, Brett said that the last pages of your book give a tough and fair evaluation of Judge Kavanaugh. Could you summarize those last pages?
Thank you for asking that. So I am an opinion writer, and I had an opinion in the end about whether Judge Kavanaugh should have been confirmed. But as I was writing the book, I really wanted to go back to my reporting roots, in which I spent most of my career at the Washington Post as a reporter, and I really, really believe that as a reporter, what you do is you provide people with enough facts to make decisions on their own. So throughout the writing process, I was having this kind of tussle with my editor, who kept saying, well, but people are going to want to know, what does Ruth Marcus think? And people are going to want to know, what does Ruth Marcus think? And I kept saying, can't I just tell them what happened? And she kept rolling her eyes at me over the phone. I could hear the eyes rolling. So I spent the month of August in Wyoming with my family, finishing the writing of the book. And one night we were out to dinner with our daughters, one of whom is here. And I said, so do you guys think I should write about like what I think happened? And they rolled their eyes visibly and said, are you kidding? Yes, of course. And so like every good mother, I listened to my daughters and thought, of course, that was totally reasonable. And so at the end of the book, I have a chapter called Zeal to Win, which I actually called Final Thoughts. After the epilogue that basically says, okay, you guys have stuck with this all along. Here's what I actually think. And what I actually think is very complicated. I was really surprised that Brett Kavanaugh was not on President Trump's original lists to be on the Supreme Court. I was really relieved when he got on those lists because I thought he was a standard run-of-the-mill Republican nominee. That is, elections have consequences. He's a true conservative, but he wasn't as extreme a conservative, I thought, as some of the other people who might have been nominated and who might well be nominated in the future. And so when he was selected, I was actually in some ways relieved that it wasn't somebody more extreme that President Trump had selected. He had selected the nominee who would have been the nominee of President Jeb Bush or President Marco Rubio. When the Blasey Ford allegations came up, I thought this was really serious. I thought it needed a really serious investigation. I concluded at the time that from everything that I saw, that her story was more credible than his denial. Not that her story about what happened was the credible story. And what I thought was that in a situation like that, where the truth can't be absolutely known, that both of the ways that we talked about this, that we talked about it like it was a job interview, that was not fair to him because this was a public and excruciating job interview. But that also it wasn't that he was entitled to the presumption of innocence. That is involved, that it's not, the presumption of innocence is not particularly, I don't find that particularly persuasive in the setting of a confirmation hearing. I thought that the benefit of the doubt in that situation should be given to the court, where you didn't know if you were confirming somebody who had engaged in this behavior. And then for me, the part that made it easiest was the testimony itself, that his intemperate outburst, which was so, some people heard it, like Susan Collins, for example, heard it and said, well, anybody who was falsely accused would understandably lash out like that. I don't think so. That's not what judges do. Senator Flake had a very good line. He said, we can't have that on the court. We can't have behavior like that on the court. I thought that pushed things for me over the edge and made it much easier to conclude that the Senate should not have voted to confirm him. So that's the lengthy answer that I inflicted on my kids at that dinner in Wyoming.
Thank you.
A couple of times tonight, you've referenced the concern conservatives had over whether he would be conservative enough. That got me to thinking about two Republican-nominated justices who turned out to be disappointments to the presidents that nominated them, Earl Warren and David Souter. Based on what you found out about Kavanaugh, do you think there's any chance he will be less conservative than conservatives would like him to be?
Well, I think there is zero chance that he will be Earl Warren and zero chance that he will be David Souter. But I think that in the spectrum of conservatism, it is entirely possible in a world where some conservatives think of Chief Justice Roberts as some kind of terrible, squishy turncoat for having voted a few times to uphold things like the Affordable Care Act, that as, and this is the evidence of Brett Kavanaugh's first term, in the alignment from super ultra conservative Clarence Thomas to just really seriously conservative Chief Justice Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh is apt to align himself closer to Chief Justice Roberts and less and more. I was going to say more liberal, but that's just not accurate. Less conservative, for example, than Justice Gorsuch. So that's how I see it coming out. I think we have maybe time for one more really quick question, if somebody has one. Oh, Janet. Yeah. Go around.
This just follows up on the last question, but do you think that his experience in the hearings will affect him as a judge, as a Supreme Court justice? And if so, how? Totally guessing, but what the heck?
Fantastic ending question. So we saw Justice Thomas was always going to be a conservative justice, but I think the experience of that confirmation hearing for him really embittered him and really drove him very much into a conservative corner. Justice Kavanaugh has told friends that he's very, without necessarily mentioning that episode, that he's very mindful of the desire to be the same kind of justice that he would have been had none of this happened. And he's a different kind of person than Justice Thomas. He enjoyed teaching at Harvard Law School. He enjoyed going to Yale Law School and going back for reunions. Justice Thomas never wanted to have anything to do with Yale Law School. He put like a 10-cent sticker famously on his Yale Law School diploma. And so I think Judge Kavanaugh would very much like someday, though it's going to be very difficult, to be welcomed back into the establishment and to be, if not admired, at least more accepted than he is in some quarters now. And so I think that kind of the likelihood is more that that this experience could lead him in some circumstances to find ways to ingratiate himself. Some of his friends mentioned this to me, to find cases that might not be the most divisive cases, but kind of easy votes to sort of make some amends with those who opposed him. So we'll see. I think this coming Supreme Court term is going to be one of the most interesting Supreme Court terms in history. So stay tuned. Thank you guys all so much.